to the Institute of Science and Technology's AI Special Interest Group online seminars, introduced by me, Richard Saldana. These seminars aim to explore a wide range of AI-related topics with invited experts, everything from AI explainability and ethics to mathematical challenges. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Markus Gesmann, who is co-founder of Insurance Capital Markets Research, a quantitative research company based in the City of London. In a moment, he is going to talk to us about using hierarchical compartmental reserving models in insurance. Markus has spent over 20 years in both insurance and capital markets. He was the former head of analysis at Lloyd's of London, where he set up a market-wide analytical performance and price monitoring framework. Markus is an expert in modelling non-life insurance portfolios and probabilistic programming. He is an honorary visiting fellow at Bayes Business School, City University of London, and is a co-founder of both the Insurance Data Science Conference and popular Bayesian Mixer meetups. Markus.
As Richard mentioned, I'd like to talk about hierarchical compartmental reserving models. It's quite a mouthful, but is something that I think is a very interesting concept that we use in the insurance industry, but there's probably wider applications in other areas as well. So today I want to talk about a little bit about the motivation, how we came up with this. This whole talk is based on a paper that I published together with Jake Morris in 2020. And I'll point you to the resources a little bit later. So we talk about the introduction and motivation, in particular in the context of insurance. I'll show you a typical reserving data set and what that looks like, and then give an introduction to these new models. And these new models are basically, well, they're not just compartmentalized in the way that the model construction, but also there's one part where you think about the mean process, the mean claims process, and then separately as well about the uncertainties. And then we bring it together with a nice case study at the end. Now, I know this is part of the AI seminar, and the question, of course, is what is artificial intelligence? Well, artificial intelligence is artificial, but at the same time, it's only as good as the information that goes into the model in the first place. And the same is true as well with these models that we're presenting here. It's very much about bringing expert opinions into the modeling process together with data and trying to find the best of both worlds in order to come up with a sensible model, in this case, for reserving. But similar models are being used in other areas. Very similar models were used during COVID to predict the spread of diseases. So let's get started. So a brief introduction to insurance and reserving. And in particular, insurance is a funny business. Insurance is a promise to pay for future claims for an upfront received premium. So in that case, we're much more similar to the church. Pray now and heaven will be there later. And so what is peculiar about insurance that at the point of sale, they don't actually know how much it will cost them to sell the product or the value of the product, which is to pay for future claims. So the insurers that sold property insurance in California last year or earlier this year probably didn't know how costly it could become. The wildfires in Los Angeles are still ongoing, and the industry loss costs have risen from 10 billion end of last year to now to 30, perhaps even 50 billion. And so that's the challenge the insurance industry is often grappling with. And reserving is the process where we try to estimate how costly will it be, and in particular for the policies that we already have sold. So there's the other aspect, which is pricing. So at the point of sale, based on various characteristics, you come up with a price for a certain product, for a certain policy. But the vast majority of policies, thankfully, have no claims. On average, perhaps 10% of the policies have claims. But then to estimate how costly will these claims be, that's the challenge in reserving. And it is indeed a challenge. So perhaps you remember the end of March, we had the Baltimore Bridge accident. And we're still trying to understand how costly this claim eventually will be. you may have legal proceedings, there are repairs, and all of these can take a very long time. In some cases, not just years, but even decades. The prominent example is perhaps asbestosis, that was used in manufacturing until the 60s, 70s, and then people got ill in the 80s, and there are still ongoing claim settling processes. I believe the industry has still about $100 billion in reserves for claims that might be the result of asbestos. So there's a lot of uncertainty around the final numbers, and that makes it very challenging, but also a fascinating area to do work in. And indeed, reserving is the main reason, or most prominent reason, why insurance companies have failed in the past. So reserving is a very important issue for insurers. On one side, they need to have enough money to stay solvent, no? Otherwise they go bust. So that's very important. On the pricing side as well, knowing if the prices you set last year and the previous years was actually sufficient will help you from the reserves, will help you then to come up with a better view on the prices for this year. And then finally as well, you want to make sure that the reserves are sufficient in order to stay solvent, but you don't want to set them too high to diminish your profit. So coming out with the right level of reserves is the challenge. So I want to look at a typical loss reserving data set. So what we've got here is an old claims data set. So we've got accident years from 91 to 2000 in those rows. And we can see in 1991, this insurance company had premium income of 10,000, and that increased to 30,600 in 2000. And then the columns to the right give then, or display then, the cumulative paid claims over time. So this is the position at the end of 2000. So the 1991 accident year, we can see in the first year they paid out $358, and then cumulative over the last 10 years, it came up to $3,901. While for the year 2000, at the end of 2000, they only paid out $344. So the question we try to answer is what the numbers will look like in the bottom right-hand triangle, and also how much more will they increase to the right. So to some extent, the challenge we face here is somewhat similar to, if I move on to a completely different subject. If you wanted to estimate or predict the height of children as they grow older. Suppose you collected data of children from different years in which they were born. They were born in 1991, and then you've got as well children born in 2000. And every year you measured their height. And now you would like to predict how tall will they be once they become an adult. And you will have some variation across years. Perhaps in certain years, children have grown quicker or didn't grow as much because there was a drought, there was nutrition problems, etc. But also you may find that there are differences between boys and girls. And so somewhat similar we have in our insurance industry as well. You've got, so we monitor the growth of claims over time, but in certain years you have big events. So the claims will be higher than in other years. And also you can distinguish, rather than boys and girls, you have perhaps different business lines that show a different characteristic in the way that claims develop over time. The traditional methods in order to forecast these triangles was to look at the year-on-year relative position and perhaps to average those relative year-on-year positions in order to come up forward with the development pattern that you can apply to come up with a forecast of future claims. To some extent, it's very similar to to say you've got a growth curve, an S-shaped function. And if you have a view on what the ultimate height or the ultimate claim might be, then you can look at the proportional development over time. It's all nice and good, but it makes it, you often only came up with a point estimator, but you want to take into account the uncertainty, and as well you would like to learn from the information across years, but acknowledging as well that perhaps certain data sets are more volatile than others. And all of that is something we want to take into account in our modeling approach as well. So here's the same data again. I just visualize this as loss ratios. So the loss ratio is the claims position divided by the premium. And on the left-hand side, we've got the incremental loss ratio, and on the right-hand side, the cumulative loss ratio. So by the incremental, I just mean that these are the incremental payments in each year divided by the premium. And on the right-hand side, we've got the cumulative position divided by premium. Now, if I look at the cumulative loss ratio development for each accident year, you can see it's fairly smooth, and you can basically use a pencil to predict it to the right-hand side. But we can also see the different accident years have different shapes to some extent. Perhaps the ultimate position is higher in certain years because of claims activities than in others. What we see on the left-hand side, when we look at the incremental loss ratio, we can see that the volatility is really in the first couple of years, because that's kind of when claims being notified. And it looks a bit more volatile. But what we can see also as we move to the right-hand side, the incremental claims information will eventually die out. And that's a really important aspect when we later think about how we model the likelihood and the volatility around this data. So let's talk about what hierarchical compartmental reserving models actually are. And this is also here the link to the paper, which we published in 2020. This was a follow-up from a paper by Jake Morris, who introduced those models a couple of years earlier. And for us, the key difference was that a lot of the traditional methods that were used in claims reserving were methods that were just applied to the data. A very prominent method was the chain ladder method, which always works, regardless of what data you have. It always comes up with an answer. And we felt that sometimes if the answer was acceptable, people would stop, hence ready, fire, aim. While if you start from first principle and you try to understand the data generating process, you really have to think about what is that you would like to model, what is your hypothesis, and only then you start applying the data to your model. So that was for us the key difference. And it's very much for us as well about a framework of how to think about modeling claims from first principle. So there are a statistical tool set that is used in actuarial science to predict future payments. And that's quite interesting as well. It is really to get a view on all the future cash flows. And it's combining the strength of compartmental models, which is about tracking claims over the different stages, and also using the hierarchical nature within the data sets. And by hierarchical nature, it's often sometimes called as well random effects or mixed effects models, so that we think there are certain aspects that are similar across cohorts, but we allow for some variation as well. And we find them fairly useful when it comes to modeling complex structures. In the case of claims reserving, we can start with a very simple model, but we can then extend and layer more and more complexity to it. And we start with trying to modeling the mean claims process, which is about compartmental models. Compartmental models are used in many disciplines. using differential equations to model certain processes. And each compartment will describe a different stage. And that makes it also easy to extend models by introducing more and more compartments. And you may have come across them perhaps in pharma, PK, PD modeling. In electrical engineering, you can model the flow of electricity. In biophysics, in epidemiology, and during COVID, you probably have heard about the basic SIR model, where you have susceptible, infected, and recovered. And also in biology to describe different populations. And probably the best known one is the Lotka-Volterra model for predator and prey populations. So all of them use differential equations to describe changes over time. And I find them quite useful in order to really understand what is actually happening in your process. And you can start simple and make them more and more complex if you feel you need that. So here's the outset for a basic and simple compartmental claims development model. And I'll start with a visual on the right-hand side. So imagine you've got a bucket. Well, you could think of it as water, but in our case, it's exposure, it's risks that you have underwritten. And most of your policies are on a 12-month policy. And imagine you've got this bucket of risk and it runs out at a certain rate over 1 year. And as the risks run out, there's a chance that might be actually a claim. And that's what these kind of dices illustrate. So there's how quickly the exposure expires, and then there's certain parts of the risk will actually have losses. And so this variable RLR stands for the reported loss ratio. So if there's a claim, what is the likely loss ratio to be? And it flows into a bucket which we call outstanding claims. Basically, that's when a policyholder phones up the insurance company and says, well, I had a claim. And someone at the insurance company or a loss adjuster will say, okay, I think this claim will cost us 100. And then it takes some time for the insurance company to process those claims. And eventually, the insurer pays out this claim to the policyholder. So there's, again, the speed with which those policies, those claims are paid. That's the parameter KP. And there's another factor which we've introduced, RRF, that's the reserve robustness factor, that basically tells us, all right, when the phone call was made, they said, we set 100 aside. If the reserve robustness factor is 100%, that means 100 was paid out. If it's lower, let's say 90%, then the initial loss estimate was more than what was needed. On the other hand, if it's over 100%, then not enough money was set aside. So this diagram explains how a policy and the claims evolve over time through the different stages. Now, mapping this into differential equations is what we have done on the left-hand side. So the exposure as EX over time, the change over time, mimics very much what we see on the right-hand side. So there's this outflow, so minus KER times the exposure, it runs out. It comes into the outstanding bucket. So the outstanding on the left-hand side, you can see there's the inflow, KER times RR times the exposure. That's the inflow in the box. And then we can see it flows out. So hence minus KP times outstanding. And the paid claims are then accumulated over time. So we can see it mimics very much the diagram on the right-hand side. So the inflow is modeled by KP, and the reserve robustness factor times outstanding. So I hope that makes sense. There's a diagram that explains the flow of information over time, and that can be directly mapped into a differential equation. Now, what you can see as well, the differential equations are fairly straightforward. We can integrate them one by one. The first one is a linear differential equation, and we've got the solution for that. You can put it into the second, and iteratively we have then the analytical solution. And that's exactly what we've done here. So on the right-hand side, you can see the differential equation and the analytical solution, and then as well what those solutions look like. So we've got the exposure, it's this exponential decline. We've got in red the outstanding claims as we get the phone calls coming in, and you can see the phone calls coming in early on and then slowly dying out. And then the paid claims is this cumulative growth. And if I add the outstanding and the paid claims together, then I've got what we call the reported claims. That's in yellow, because that's kind of how much I know I will have to settle eventually. That's the information that I've reserved for but not yet paid, plus the paid claims. And that looks all nice and smooth because we've used differential equation. Now in the real world later on, we will see, and we saw already earlier from the example data set, it's not that smooth. And we will talk about this in a bit. But first of all, I will talk about how we can actually enhance those compartments to perhaps introduce more complexity in our claims process. So when we think about our claims process, you might think there are certain claims that are very easy to settle. And so you have a claims notification, the insurer pays the claim very quickly because it's easy to assess, but there might be other claims that go through a secondary process. Perhaps there's some litigation, you name it. And so there's a delay to that settlement process. So here we introduced another compartment. So the information or the exposure again comes into the outstanding bucket first, but then certain claims are settled immediately and other claims go through a secondary stage. And we can map this again into differential equations in exactly the same way as on the previous slide. We literally just follow the flow, the input, or the inflows and outflows. Inflows are positive, outflows are negative. And so now we've added another differential equation to our dynamical system. And what that allows us is basically to introduce more flexibility. We've introduced another parameter. I can still integrate this. You may want to use software for that, or use a numerical solution, as we will do a little bit later. But now I've got additional complexity, and that means I've got more flexibility in my growth curves. So my exposure is still, in this case, this very simple exponential decline, but I can now see the blue line, the paid, has now what we call a fatter tail, has more flexibility, because I've allowed for the additional process for a secondary, perhaps litigation process taking place. So it will take longer for these claims to settle and be fully paid. Okay. But I can start simple. And if I just briefly go back to this as well. So you can see we introduced another parameter, KP2. If I set it back to 0, I'm back to the previous model, which is really important a little bit later on when we think about modeling this from a statistical point. I can set my parameters for KP2 close to 0. I say, well, actually, I don't think I need it, but I want to have the flexibility just in case that my data actually requires a further parameter. So I allow for this flexibility, but I'm not wedded to it in the first place.
Markus, apologies for interrupting. Patrick Hogan had a question about slide 16. I think it's a very basic question here about the yellow line.
Yes.
Overshooting the ultimate. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. In this, you cannot see the parameters I've used here, but indeed here I used an RF factor either above or below 1. I can't remember, but yeah, that was on purpose. That was on purpose. I think, yeah, you can probably see the parameters I used in the paper.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. So as I said, compartmental or compartment models can easily be extended. As I said, to incorporate different claims processes, faster or slower. So you can separate earning and reporting process. You can have time-dependent parameters as well, if you think that's necessary. You can bring in calendar effects. But I find it easier to certainly start simple and then only introduce more complexity if you really need it. The analytical solution is often cannot always be derived. I wouldn't try always, certainly by hand. I've used Wolfram Alpha in the past. That's quite good. But more often, you just use a numerical solver. And certainly when we talk about using later on Stan or PyMC, you can just write down the differential equation and then a numerical solver, wrong cutter, will do the magic in the background. So let's talk about modeling now the uncertainties. So we talked about modeling the mean process. And what I really like about modeling the mean process using those compartmental models, as well as if I just briefly go back, these parameters I've got here, they have a natural meaning in the real world. So when I talk to an expert about this, they will have a view how quickly, or how long does it take to settle a claim. It's not a parameter that comes out of nowhere, but it has actually a real meaning to the processes we have in the workforce today. So that means as well, if I think my process will change because I don't know, for whatever reasons, I believe I can settle my claims faster or it will take longer, I can see what kind of impact it may have on my business from first principles. So that's something which I think is very important to note as well, is these parameters have a real meaning in our real life, rather than using, I don't know, you could use as well for various growth curve. You say, all right, I've got a variable growth curve, I've got a normal, whatever it is, and then you have 2, 3 parameters, but it's then slightly more difficult to explain what these parameters actually mean. So we thought about the mean process, and now we have to think about the various parameters. There's on one hand side the parameters we introduced earlier, but also about the likelihood framework as well. How will my data actually behave? What kind of uncertainty do I expect from my data? But what I quite like about this as well is with this model, even if I have got no data and I literally just simulate from my model to say, all right, I've got my mean process, I made assumptions about my prior parameter distributions, I made assumptions about as well the likelihood distribution. I can basically simulate data for a business plan. So come up with a planning loss ratio. And that's kind of what I think where my mean roughly will be. But I also can simulate using the likelihood what kind of variability I expect in my data. So it's then quite helpful when it comes to capital modeling. And then once I've got actual data, I can rerun my model again, but now feeding the data through this model as well. And that gives me an indication as well to get more insight about what the true expected loss ratio might be. So if I could run the same year again and again, what the average loss ratio might be. And the other aspect, which is really important as well, is given where I am today, how much I paid already, and from the model, looking at the cash flows or the payments that I will have in the future, I can get a sense of what the ultimate position for this particular year is, given how much I paid already. So these kind of hierarchical compartmental reserving models are very rich in their use cases as well, because you get a lot of information out of them, not just a point estimator. but a full distribution. But you have to specify all these distributions. So it's quite labor intensive on one end, but on the other end, it's very transparent as well. Now, the one thing we grappled a little bit in our paper was, does it actually matter if I model the cumulative or the incremental data? And in particular, when I think about the likelihood, often you've got a good understanding how you want to model the mean, but it's then how do you model the volatility as well in my data? And in many models, you kind of want to model the volatility in a way that is not too complex. So if you think about just a simple linear regression, you often assume that the variance is constant. When we think about modeling something with a log normal distribution, and that kind of makes sense in our context because claims are never less than zero, but you never get paid back by the policyholder, they're skewed to the right. And often the assumption of a constant coefficient of variation makes sense as well. The bigger the claims, the more volatility there is. But now looking at our development over time, and if we wanted to make an assumption like constant coefficient of variation, using that on the cumulative data doesn't really make much sense, because we know that the more mature a claim is, the more stable it will be. And that's kind of what we're seeing in the incremental data. The incremental data will eventually go down to zero. And assuming a constant coefficient of variation on the incremental data makes the modeling of the volatility much easier. So that's why we think it's much easier to model the incremental data rather than the cumulative data. So on the left-hand side, what this picture shows is having modeled the cumulative data with a constant coefficient of variation, and you end up with this volatility on the right-hand side, which we're actually not really observing in the real world. And on the right-hand side, we modeled the incremental data with a constant coefficient of variation, and then calculate the cumulative data based on this. And then you have monotone lines going upwards, and that's exactly what we're observing in the data as well. So our recommendation is easier to model the incremental data than the cumulative. So with all this work done, we have now pretty much developed a data generating process. And the data generating process is about how the mean is moving over time, and as well the various parameters that we can use in order to come up with a full cash flow distribution over time. So that allows us on one hand side to come up with prior predictive distribution, as I said, without using the data. And that's really helpful. So running the model without data gives us an understanding if the model is sensible in the first place. Because if the model generates output that doesn't look anything like the data, or not even like the data, doesn't look anything like you would expect, then you know that your model is probably not specified correctly. So it's always I would very much encourage anyone who's going down this route and to develop those models is to start with a model that is very simple and basic, and then run the simulations without any data input. And only once you think that the model output looks sensible, then you start running the model with the data to come up with the posterior predictive distribution as well. And from the posterior predictive distribution, you got a lot more insight, as I said, into the cash flows, which you then can use to come up as well with a distribution of the reserves of how much money you need to set aside. So let's go through a little case study. And for this case study, I'm using the data set I showed you at the beginning, so which is this data set here. And that's also the section 4 of the paper. So in this case, we only have this paid claims information, and basically we want to forecast how this will evolve over time. And to keep it really simple, we will assume that we have, from perhaps a compartmental model, we have a growth curve, some kind of S-shaped curve from 0 to 100% that describes the payment development over time. And if you have that, if you then as well know the expected loss or loss ratio in this case for each accident year, then the product of the expected loss ratio times the growth curve gives you then the paid loss ratio in each accident year and each development year. So it's a slightly simplified model, but it should be sufficient in order to illustrate this concept. And we can hide some of the complexity. So now here's the shocker. Using these kinds of model, actually you have to specify all your parameters and put distributions around it. So we start at the top. I'm saying my incremental paid loss ratio for each accident year and development years, that's I and J, follow a log normal distribution. And the median, that's by the parameter eta, depends on the time, some parameters, and an expected loss ratio for each accident year. And then there's my volatility parameter or my sigma. Now the median, we know that, as you can see, is my expected loss ratio times the growth curve, but because I'm looking at incremental data, I've got G at time Tj minus C at time Tj minus 1. Then I've got various parameters as well. And the various parameters are set that I've got a mean, but that's given by mu, but I allow a little bit of variability as well with the parameter u. You will see I've got mean parameters for the expected loss ratio in the priors for KE, DR, KP1, and KP2. But I allow a little bit of variation across accident years. And so I've got this additional parameter u from a multivariate normal distribution with a mean of 0. So which is basically saying, as a starter for 10, I believe there's one parameter for each accident year that should always be the same, but I do allow for a little bit of variation if the data is robust enough that allows the model to go away from the population mean and make adjustments across accident years. And then finally, I have to specify as well my assumptions on the sigma parameter. I have to write all of this down, which is a bit tedious, but at the same time as well, it makes it very transparent and someone else can challenge my assumptions. They might challenge perhaps a log normal distribution for the likelihood is not right. Perhaps a gamma would be better, and equally as well for some of the priors. But then again, if the data is sufficient, then the priors shouldn't really matter that much. You want to provide priors that are reasonable, but you don't really be too specific either. Now, to implement the model, you need some kind of probabilistic programming language. Popular choices are Stan or PyMC3. In our paper, we used an interface to Stan from R. There's a package called BRMS for Bayesian regression model for Stan. And the nice thing about BRMS is that you've got an interface very much to GLMs. So you can specify your model like with a GLM in R, and it will generate the Stan code for you, run the model, and provide the output back into R directly for you to analyze it further. So I'm not going through any code here. Go back to the paper. There's example codes in the appendix. So I want to focus a little bit more on the output. So one of the outputs is this chart here. So here we've got now again the incremental loss ratios here for each accident year. Those are the black dots. The blue line is now the model mean from this model from the previous slide, and the gray area shows the 95% credible interval of the model output. And we can see that the model seems to capture the data fairly well. There's quite a bit of volatility in the data, but most of the data points are within the 95% credible interval. For the older years, of course, we've got a lot more data, and it's easier to understand where things might continue in the future. For the more recent years where we have only one data point or two data points, there's of course a lot more uncertainty going forward. But I can now use this information to predict future payments. And it's those future payments that are of interest to me. But there are two aspects to this. So on one hand side, as I said, we've got the historical data, and if I go back mentally to the cumulative position, I know where I am already. And now I've got the expected future cash flows. I can either glue them to my latest position, where I already am, to get a view of where I finally will end up. That's kind of my ultimate loss ratio. Or I could go back to the origin and aggregate all the expected incremental payments to come up with a view, if I could rerun the same accident year again and again, what the expected loss ratio would be. Yeah, so disregarding where I am today. And why is that so important? I'll come back to that in a second, because it allows me to distinguish between. I will come back to that in a second. Anyway, so here, first of all, we've got the population metrics from the model for the expected loss ratio across all accident years. It's about 49%. And as well, we've got various other metrics, and equally as well for the parameters in my model. The expected loss ratio is of particular importance to me. It's 49%, but there will be some variation across the years. And it's really the variation across the years of the expected loss ratio that probably gives me an indication as well of the underlying pricing cycle. If I actually charge the same quantity against exposure year on year. And so what this chart illustrates is how the expected loss ratio is moving over the years. So we had the population. So the average across all years is 49%. But here we can see that in certain years, there's a little bit of variation from that population century figure of 49%. And this is kind of our U parameter, which we said we start off with thinking that every accident year is close to the mean, but basically we add 0 to it, but we allow a little bit of variation. And we can see now that in 1992, there seems to be enough evidence in the data that this particular year is somewhat different compared to the other years. And equally as well in 1993. So if I go back quickly to my data here, then move this. Yeah, so we see 91 is this year here at the bottom. And then we've got 92 and 93. They're much higher than the other years. So clearly there's something there's enough evidence in the data that these 2 years are clearly somewhat different. So if I go back, to my case study. And let's look at this from a slightly different perspective. So now I take my population mean of 49% and add the variation across each accident year. So I've got the accident years running down in the rows and the expected loss ratio. And as you recall, 92 was already much higher, 93 much higher. Indeed, now we're saying actually the average for that year is about 53% and nearly 50% in the following year. So that's the expected loss ratio. The other aspect was the ultimate loss ratio. So that's basically, given where I am today, if I add the future cash flows, where do I think I will eventually end up? So that's a slightly different metric. And you can see 92, despite, so on average, I would have, if I could rerun the year, I might have ended up 53%. But given how far claims have already developed, the end point for this particular year is closer to 58.7%. So there's more volatility in the ultimate loss ratios because of claims having happened or not. And you see that as well in the estimated error. For the expected loss ratio is roughly the same across all accident years, but for the ultimate loss ratios, it increases as we get to newer years. So because 91, 92, there's not much more claims development to expect. So the error around my forecast for the ultimate is small. So the expected loss ratio on the left-hand side probably gives me a bit more insight into, as I said, the pricing cycle over time. And by pricing cycle, did I get the same amount of premium for the same level of exposure? And that's usually a very insightful metric. What the actuary needs at the end of the day is, how much money do I need to set aside? And that's something I can now get for free to some extent from my model, because I've got now all the future cash flow projections and I can aggregate them up. And I get not just the mean, but I get the full distribution, which is really helpful because you get an understanding of the uncertainty, but also for an insurance company, their capital requirement is related to the reserving risk. And what the reserving risk is basically what I've got in the tail. And in particular, usually people look at the 1 in 200 event, or the 99.5th percentile. And now I can read out the 99.5th percentile from my simulations will be something at the on the right hand side, but the value of 35 or 40, whatever it is. But I get the full distribution. From this model, I've got a model that is transparent. I've got the various parameters. I can explain the parameters. I can explain as well how I came up with my development curve, so to speak, from using differential equations. And as a result, I've got I think a model that is very much explainable from first principle. So with that, I'd like to come to my summary. So our key ideas, or well, in particular, what we're trying to encourage is start fitting the model to the data, not the data to the model, which we've seen time and time again in the past, that you've heard the data, you run the model, and if you're happy with the answer, you stop thinking. So this is very much a framework, and it's very much a framework as well to think about the data generating process. And as I said earlier, come up with the model, simulate from the model. If it looks something like what you expect from the real data, continue. Otherwise, go back, refine your model. The other aspect as well, which is because we've got this compartmental approach, we can encapsulate the various business processes in one model. That means also that I can use the data that I have from these different processes at the same time. A lot of the traditional methods in actuarial science and for reserving, they use either the paid data or the outstanding data or the incurred data, what they call, and they run them on different triangles. They come up with different answers, and it's difficult then to reconcile. While here, because we have a comprehensive model, we can use all the information at the same time, and the parameters are linked to each other. So I don't have to use different assumptions. Yeah, let me reiterate again, this is a framework, not a method. And as I pointed out earlier, it's a very transparent model. We find it provides additional insights into the business process. And in particular, as well, as I said, if there are changes to the business process, perhaps you have a new claim settling system, or there's a bigger claims team, or someone is ill, because you have an understanding of what parameter this might impact, you can actually then run the model and see what the likely impact might be on your model output, and also for the business process. And then finally, it's a neat way of incorporating a lot of expert knowledge as well. In particular, let's say you go into a new line of business or to a new geography where you haven't got any information or any historical data. With this one, if you have a sense of what the parameters might be, you can generate this cash flow from first principle to get an understanding for a business planning process, what to expect if you would choose to go down that strategy. I think with that, I'll end here. The references. The first one is to the paper we talked about. There's the PDF version, or there's also a website, basically, which we generated from R Markdown. And also there's the original paper from Jake Morris from 2016. So, thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Markus. Got a nice question here from Zhao Li. But before we get there, I've got some. I've got a couple of very, very basic questions around your sort of triangle, loss triangle, if I may. And these are very basic questions. So there's a sort of suggestion here that the insurance is in perpetuity. I didn't quite get this because, take 1991, there's a premium. So that's the, premium or premiums that have been collected, £10,000, shall we say. And then the claims evolve over years, and here they are, they're cumulative. So I got my head around that, understand the metric, etc. But I mean, £10,000 is paid in 1991. How many years does that cover me for?
Well, it covers you for the exit that happened in 1991, let's say, but it
Right.
might take ages to finally sell them.
I
So
see.
suppose,
I see. Yeah.
if you get injured and we have to pay for your carer for the next until you die.
Right. Okay. Think about it like that. So it's just yeah. Okay. I've got it. Thank you. So because I was interpreting it as, oh well, I've paid this premium, and then in 1992 there is an event. But does that appear in the 1991 figures? But no, you've clarified that for me. Thank you. So the other question, very simple question I had, was around the sort of time value of money. Does this take into consideration the time value of money? Because £10,000 now is worth a lot more than £10,000 in 5 years' time.
You're absolutely right. And when it comes to what you have to do for reserve setting, you will have to do that. Absolutely. I haven't done this in this talk or in that model. That's a separate discussion. And It's a separate model as well, what kind of assumptions you want to take there. But yeah, absolutely crucial.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Markus. That's very clear. So let's got a two-part question from Zhao Li here. And he's saying, what are the ethical considerations around data usage and bias in these predictions? I think that's a very good question.
Well, insurance companies will use, in the first and foremost, their own data. So it's the data they have on their portfolio. By and large, at the moment, insurance companies still aggregate data in order to have a robust data set. There is a movement towards using individual claims data for this purpose. And then, there will be some ethical questions will come about. I couldn't possibly comment on this, how it's done by insurers, but it's certainly something they are mindful of, and the actual profession in particular as well.
Sure. I mean, my take on it is that this type of modeling needs to be objective, otherwise it doesn't really serve anyone's purpose. It isn't a simple monopoly insurer. We have insurers are competing against each other.
Yeah, and it's also not so much a problem for reserving. It's much more of a problem when it comes to pricing. And there are certain metrics that are not allowed to be used for pricing. For example, if I'm not mistaken as well, it started a couple of years ago that when it comes to selling motor policies, I think ethnicity or gender is not allowed to be used for pricing purposes. So it is certainly a very important topic in the insurance industry, but I'm not involved in it on a day-to-day basis, so I couldn't really comment on this.
Sure. And that relates to sort of the second part of Xiaoli's question. What is to stop companies exploiting the predictive capabilities of the model to avoid or reduce claim payouts? And I think you've sort of touched on that, haven't you, in terms of differentiating between clients?
Yes, absolutely.
So, okay. So the answer is,
we'll
leave it to the legislators to sort of say what's unfair.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll leave it to those. I think for insurers, first of all, it's more to think about, all right, do I want to be in this line of business? Is this line of business profitable given the competitive nature? And that's a lot more important than to most insurers at the moment than the individual policies decision. So do I still want to insure properties in California at the moment? Or do I think the risk is too high? Or perhaps I think now is the time to go in because a lot of insurers will pull out. And yeah, insurance premiums will most likely go up. But will they be sufficient? I don't know.
That is a tricky area.
But it's similar in the UK as well. There are certain areas which are prone to flooding.
Flood, yes.
Yeah. And then often you have state insurers to come in to take some of that risk.
Moving swiftly on, Zana has asked, can we consider this type of model as a particular type of Bayesian network based on a prefixed tree? Now, feel free to sort of handle that, but Zana, you may want to interject and add a little more to this question. Very happy for you to unmute and join in the conversation.
Well, it's certainly a Bayesian framework and a Bayesian model as well. Zona?
It looks like a bit similar approach to modeling. And if we consider Bayesian networks as models based on any certain graph, and this type of model is based only on tree, and we have no possibility to change this tree during process of modeling. Do we have any advantages considering what is similar or in these kinds of models? I think it could be in case when we choose from different kinds of models, and maybe if we need to think about, maybe we'll start from more simple model, and then if in some cases we'll continue with Bayesian networks, or maybe not. That's my question.
I'm not quite sure I can make the link to a Bayesian network immediately. So what we're trying to do here as well is a model that has enough complexity, but for some of the parameters, we set them close to zero in order to keep the model simple. But if the data is sufficient, the model can move away from those parameters that have been set close to zero to allow for this complexity. I'm not quite sure I understand how this is related to a tree. It's not, but that might be just my lack of knowledge.
Zana, would you care to comment further?
I think I need some additional time, and if you permit me, I will write you a message with this idea. Maybe we can discuss this approach, or maybe there are not any useful knowledge. I don't know.
Oh
Okay.
yeah, I'm very happy to take this offline. Thank you.
Got a question here. Someone's asking how hard would it be to extend such a model to individual claims development? It's sort of, perhaps a bolt-on Poisson process for the arrival of claims.
Well, how hard is it? I don't know. Depends on your prior knowledge. Some might find it easy, some might find it difficult. I think you can certainly extend these models further and add more complexity to it. Absolutely. But from my experience as well, they are fantastic, but they can be challenging as well, in particular when it comes to taking the right prior distributions, making sure the differential equations are specified correctly. Absolutely, yes. You can do a lot more with it, but there can become a bit of a beast as well.
Right. Well, there don't seem to be any further questions. I think this has been a really insightful talk, Markus. Thank you very much on behalf of the IST and the audience present. Certainly, if I'm doing any sort of cash flow modeling, I like to see a distribution rather than point estimates. Makes far more sense to in terms of characterizing the uncertainty. So I'm greatly in favour of what you've got here. But of course, as George Box said, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Some are useful, yes.
We always bear that in mind. Anyway, thank you again. And
you're welcome.
If you enjoyed this seminar, you might like to take a look at our istonline.org.uk website. In addition, all our seminars are recorded and are available on YouTube. So if you go to the IST website, you'll find the link to our YouTube series. Thank you very much for attending, and we'll hope to see you at a future seminar. Goodbye.
Bye.